DevOps Iterations.
And here we are, episode number 6 of Abnormal DevOps Iterations, and we have David Sandilands from Puppet, who will talk, I guess we will talk about Puppet itself and the world around it. But first of all, David, how are you and what are you doing in these days?
Yeah, I'm good, Alessandro. Thanks for having me on. So I've kind of started to fully move into my new role as community and dev relations lead at Puppet. We're right now just going to finish going to events. You know, we were at DevOps Days Ghent, with DevOps Days London. Working with Bricks out in Ghent as well. So I've kind of been a bit back and forth, and we're kind of into the fresh planning sessions for events coming into the next year. Particularly config management camp in February.
Cool. So I am a big lover of Puppet, a user for long, so I have a lot of questions to ask you about Puppet. First of all, according to you, Puppet, it was a great tool for the times when it was done, solving problems of those times, which were mostly related to managing operating systems. Now, in a cloud-native world, so to say, what is the position of Puppet? What is the present and the future of a tool like Puppet?
Yeah, I think the thing with Puppet is, I think there's definitely positions around containerization Puppet can look at. And we've obviously had like our Kubernetes installer, and I think there's still a lot of configuration problems around cloud native. I think the other key thing we've kind of seen in the market overall is, I think there was a period where there was a lot of hype, where it felt like, there was, I in my previous job when I worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland, we more or less got a roadmap that said, right, things are going to be IaaS, then they're going to move to CAS, then they're going to move to PaaS, and, everything would just move away and everything would kind of end up cloud native on the cloud. And I think that's kind of been pushed back a bit. So, in the State of DevOps report, we did ask for kind of reports around technology and what was in production. And we could see, Kubernetes is only in production at 20% of organizations. So I think there's that problem of there's the kind of the hype around, what consultants and what people are kind of doing and is new, and kind of what kind of stays with us as something that needs to keep working. So, Puppet's very mature now. And, it's kind of got that very stable place around VMs. I think the key thing is, kind of being better with the data that's there, because we get a lot of information, a lot of data, both events and configuration from Puppet. And I think it's a struggle for people to know how to kind of actually access that data and interpret it, without having to do a lot of work. And I think, immediately linking into AI, as everyone inevitably does, I think that's, where it'll become more interesting, as people want to be able to find, abnormal patterns, or just to be able to query things quickly and understand their state better.
Yeah, actually, related to this, Chris Boitert in the second episode did a good remark about this. Innovation is fast, adoption is slow.
Yes.
And so we still have around a lot of systems, IT infrastructures, which are based on not the cutting edge latest things that you see at the conferences, where you typically see the newest and coolest things, but there is still around a lot of stuff which is still to be managed, so to say, in the old way. And also, if I can add my 2 cents, whenever people ask me, but what we are still doing with Puppet, my answer is, well, Puppet makes sense to be used whenever you have to manage a system which is whose life is longer than 30 days or something like that. And that's a system you have to manage. So how do you think, how many systems, operating systems, let's stay on classic systems, virtual or physical machines, you will think there will be around in the next days, years, there will be still computers around to manage clients, desktops, servers, virtual machines, physicals, cloud instances. Okay, there will be a lot of other stuff, cloud native, cloud solutions, services, and everything, but also a lot of hardware under the hoods and virtual machines.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at growth, I mean, the thing is, we've seen from various kind of analysts that, the growth of VMs is still something like 3%. So it's that thing of it's still a growing market, and obviously 3% of the kind of size of the number of VMs there is a lot. And I think it's almost like we got a little bit of a replay of maybe what happened when I was first coming into computing, where I think there was a kind of big opinion of, oh God, we really need to get rid of these mainframes because that's the old technology, and really this should all be migrating to new things. Now, plenty of things did migrate, and plenty of things plenty of things changed, but ultimately mainframes run in a modern way now. And I just say that kind of, VM world, I think for the foreseeable future, I don't see it really going anywhere. I think it's, we've seen obviously kind of a narrow down of OSs. I remember Nigel Kirsten describing somebody as old school because they'd worked on Solaris and AIX, and I had to kind of sadly ask, am I even older if I worked on HPUX? Now, obviously, those kind of operating systems have largely disappeared. So, the breadth of operating systems we probably used initially on Puppet is certainly narrowed down a lot. But then we've seen other things come in terms of like AWS's kind of cloud specific operating systems they offer, and other things like that. So I think it's one of those things where all these organizations like Puppet, like VMware, Red Hat are all kind of working out how to mature exactly into that space, because it's it's no longer a fast growth space, obviously, but it's something that just doesn't go away. And I think the big challenge becomes that when I think about when I was a Unix admin originally and I was using Puppet, the number of people there was to servers and the number of technologies there was, it's just kind of grown exponentially. So I think the challenge for our kind of organization is we have to expect that there isn't just some guy now just working on Puppet. They're often looking after Puppet, they're looking after Terraform, they're looking after a series of tools as part of their platform. And they don't have the kind of the time they used to have to do as much digging, as much work. So the tools have to work a lot quicker for them. And and the data has to be far more accessible.
Right. So in terms of data, there are some plans or actually products already in the pipeline, or actually there's something already done in order to better use the Puppet data, which is generated all the times.
Yeah, I mean we started, so it actually was only just released this month for Puppet Enterprise, Puppet Enterprise Advanced. The Puppet, the Observability data connector as as the first version. So that kind of looks to kind of put a node exporter in Prometheus format on your Puppet Enterprise server, so that you can just pull event data into whatever observability tool you're using. Because we were sort of aware that we had there's no big winner in that observability space. I know when you're looking at something like ServiceNow, for example, it's such a big winner, you can so easily target it. It was this kind of challenge for us of how do we create enough integrations, and it seemed that actually like the easier answer was just to kind of let people pull that data out into their observability tool. I think in terms of looking forward, making that data more accessible via AI methods as appropriate is going to be what we will be looking into the next year. Because I think it's that thing of, we've often found, yes, having that data accessible is very useful, and bring it into the observability tool, and that allows certain very experienced people to kind of be able to create the the graphs and views they need and the dashboards. But I think we still all want to be able to just query our system in a more natural way. And I think that's always been the most exciting part of AI that's come through so far, which is just being able to kind of ask questions rather than having to worry about all the technicalities.
Just to get a bit into the detail, what kind of data exactly are we getting in the observability tool you are
So
mentioning?
the first version has essentially focused on the event data. So what you get out of a report. So number of resources changed, times for running, that kind of thing is as the first version. So basically everything you get out of a kind of a report run, just so we can kind of focus on people making sure they're actually kind of focus on how their state's running, because when I was working on a 20 to 30,000 size estate, you have that problem as you look on the enterprise console, which is maybe you have kind of 5 servers that have kind of a risk against them, and we know that they've got an error or something like that. But is that the same 5 servers that was reporting, or has something kind of actually come out and come back in? So we just wanted to make that kind of report data more accessible so people can, create the views they need. Because one of the very strange things I found was I expected, like, if you have the bank I used to work with, like RBS, and any other of our listed financial customers, you would think, well, they're all big banks, they probably all have quite the same opinion. But it was always amazing when I did consultancy work how different they wanted their views to be, and how kind of different their priorities were in terms of just the exact kind of events they wanted to see. So, we spent a lot of time, I think, trying to make graphs that suited everyone. And I think in the end, you kind of compromised and they didn't suit anyone. So I think just, trying to reduce our effort down so we can focus better on getting more data into this, and just allowing people to kind of, create the graphs in the tools they're familiar with. And alongside that, we've got the SEs, the sales engineers working, producing example graphs and so on to give people the kind of right ideas of how they can use that data.
Okay, good, interesting. Actually, I think it's a perfect starting point, because the events is about what is happening in our infrastructure. So gathering data and managing it in a same way gives a direct and immediate view on what is changing in the infrastructure. In terms of product line and product map, so we have for more than 1 year now Puppet 8 out, but I don't know how has been the adoption of Puppet 8 and the updates to Puppet 8 for what you see.
I mean, I think you often get an interesting thing, because the community tends to be very quick to want to adopt and get there. What we then see is obviously we have that kind of gap with the enterprise customers, because until Puppet 8 is in the long-term support release of Puppet Enterprise, a lot of our enterprise customers will hold back and wait until that. That old kind of thing of never take a 0.0 release or whatever. So right now, I'd actually say is peak adoption for enterprise customers. We have a number of customers going through right now. We've been working on some tooling around that. So we have a Puppet Upgrader gem, which we are just working on to release for enterprise customers, which kind of helps you by, you run it against a module and it will look at your metadata JSON, go out to the Forge and say, are all your dependencies listed compatible with Puppet 8 based on the versions you've put? And it'll do kind of checks around Hiera, because we've deprecated Hiera 3, and it then kind of wraps around PDK 3.3, to pull that in and run it, so it can do all the checks in terms of standard lib functions deprecated. It can do the checks around making sure you've got the right data types, and all that kind of good linting people expect.
So just to understand, this gem is included in PDK 3.3?
No, so we decided to make it separate, so we weren't reliant on a PDK release. So kind of part of the focus for the developer experiences, we're sort of aware the PDK ended up having a lot of stuff pushed into it at points. So we have been focusing on trying to trim it down to what people are definitely using and what is best. And then when we have cases like big cases like when you're doing a Puppet upgrade, it's going to be one of those events of you're going to do the upgrade, and then that's going to be it. So we're going to focus on having these supporting tools. When Puppet 9 comes out, we will aim to have that Puppet upgrader come out with Puppet 9. But we're making sure this is released now for enterprise customers to make sure they have the best support. So We're just working on getting that gem released, and then we'll make it publicly available to enterprise customers. But yeah, it's just that kind of good way to kind of help you automate some of the checks, because I think when people initially look at Puppet 8, they've often not looked at the Puppet code in depth at some time. So when they kind of get a list of things of, well, Ruby 3, Ruby 3 doesn't allow, it has idempotent variables, and, you have to have data types. These standard lib functions might not work. People see a long list and they're just not sure, well, how badly affected is my code going to be? So, with the Puppet upgraded, we want to give people a way just to quickly run through their modules and, then have that kind of output, so they could, have an idea of the scale of what they got to change. Because I think for a lot of users, it's not going to be that big a deal. But, it's always surprising what's kind of, been done in code and has just worked for so long that you've kind of forgotten it's there.
So when this gem is going to be public?
I expect within this quarter for it to be public.
Okay.
But yeah, we're just working out the details.
I ask for a direct interest. I have at least 2 or 3 cases where I need to do upgrades and support customers in doing upgrades. So
yeah, I mean, we actually literally have one customer running a beta of it with us just now. So, it's at an advanced stage. So it's in terms of that release, I'm always cautious about committing to something before my engineers have definitely confirmed the date, but it should be this quarter.
Okay, good. So you mentioned already Puppet 9. What you can tell us about it? What it will have and when you plan to release it?
Well, actually, I can't tell you a great deal at all about Puppet 9, to be honest. I mean, I think if you look at the historic release cycle, you'd kind of expect Puppet 9 maybe in like a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. I think there might be, what might be interesting, Perforce, I think there might be some discussion about how often we release. Because I think, I think it was actually mentioned in another episode in terms of how mature the Puppet language is. And I think that can be a bit of a funny thing is, we do have questions about how often we're releasing now and, whether that is actually the right cycle. Because I think, if you look at the kind of differences, when you were going from something like Puppet 4 to Puppet 5, that there was huge changes in there. But, when I kind of wrote the book, and talked about the modern era of Puppet, when you're going from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8, it's, there are obviously incremental improvements, but it's not the kind of necessarily the same major changes you saw in the past. Definitely. So I think there's some interesting things I'd like to see in Puppet 9. So maybe I'll say what I'd like to see. Okay. I know, for example, I think it's TR Link. He had the kind of no-op module, which allowed you to kind of more easily kind of just say, I want a class and all of its contents to be in no-op. And I know a number of customers found that useful, so I'd like to see that be a core feature. I think, personally, in terms of how encryption is handled, I know we had various modules like Node Encrypt and, just in terms of how secrets and sensitive works, I think just having a more complete solution through Puppet 9 would, for me, would be ideal. And I think that would be my expectation, because obviously going to Puppet 8, there was some big dependency updates. We were getting to kind of, Ruby 3.2 and, just making sure that we were in a much better position for maintenance. So my expectation would be around that sort of thing, where there'll be that debate of what features are customers finding most useful that right now are kind of supplied externally, and, what can we kind of suitably integrate in and just make it a much easier experience.
Right. Yeah. And as Chris said, it is a mature tool. Let's hope they don't break it. I don't think.
No, I mean, and I think that can be the very odd thing is, once you get a tool like Puppet into the place it is, once the sort of excitement of like, oh, let's add constant new features, it comes down to these things of, once you're working at massive scale, you've then going to got to look at things in a different way, because it's kind of about, well, how do I make the scale work for people? How do I make sure they're not scared to death to update code? How do I make sure they can understand, when they, we've got customers with over 100,000 nodes now, And the in terms of how they're trying to scale Puppet Enterprise, it's been pushing up and up and up in terms of the numbers that we can support with the infrastructure. So I think that's the kind of things the language starts to focus on, is what makes things easier, what makes it so that particularly when you have people moving off, you have your champions who were there for a long time, and they understand that whole history, and they know how to build these things up. How do we make it easier for them to interpret? And maybe in some cases kind of remove options that don't make sense anymore. I mean, I had an interesting discussion around the file type offering an option where you can say directory, file, or just present. And I couldn't find anyone who could tell me why you would ever just say present instead of file or directory or symlink. So and the style guide enforces that, but it confuses customers that that's an option, because why offer the option if there's not a good use case? So I think some of that of just trying to maybe even trim down the language to say, well, what, we can evaluate what people are using. We can scan, the forge and look at things, and just think about how do we make it easier for people, because people don't want as much choice, I think, as they used to. They want to kind of know what's best practice to do things, and we'll try and implement it like that.
So in terms of ease of use, now there is, I guess we mentioned before the fact that the landscape is there is still a lot of stuff to do in this world of systems to manage, but there is not only Puppet doing that. And I guess the major competitor now is Ansible. Ansible, let's be honest, is more used than Puppet at the moment.
Yep. Yeah.
And honestly, I think Puppet does things much better than Ansible for most of the stuff which has to do. But it's still not being used as much as Ansible. I guess you have your own ideas on why this is happening. Do you feel like sharing them, and maybe what we can do to close the gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things for me. Again, this is good timing, because I'm writing a product document, Puppet GitOps. So I feel like there's this odd problem with Puppet in terms of, when you're first teaching someone Puppet, you'll commonly show them the Puppet resource command, and you'll say, look, here's how you can generate some code. And then you start kind of getting towards the forge and talking about modules. And then it feels like the difficulty ramps right up, because then you kind of have to start talking about, well, let's stand up a Puppet server, and let's talk about control repos and Puppet files. And you then have to add quite a lot of concepts very quickly. Whereas I feel personally, if there was a kind of middle ground in terms of being able to say, well, you know what, it's a perfectly legitimate purpose, particularly for learning, to say, hey, I want to take a module from the forge, and I want to just be able to pass it some parameters and data, and I want to just point at a server and say, apply my code over there, just so you can kind of get that immediate feel of, I can combine modules from the forge, I can take some data, and I can put the right kind of classification together and just apply it. It's interesting because Bolt version 4 coming out is quite important for that, to get Bolt fully up to date. Because when you look at Bolt and some of the capabilities it has in terms of being able to say, run a Puppet apply on a server, and pull down modules to your Bolt project, I think to me, I'm kind of ambitious just to kind of get that wrapped up well, so that you move away from that initial answer, which we've got to be honest here. Ansible does give you that immediate good feeling of, I just want to point and shoot and get something done, because yes, once you get to scale, once you get to the complexity, and once you kind of want to really enforce state and compliance, I can honestly say, even as a Puppet employee, I honestly say Puppet wins hands down in terms of that very stateful use case. But when you're just trying to test it and you want to know at a very small scale, we're asking you to kind of pick up too many concepts there. So I think just trying to provide that middle ground, which just kind of makes it so that, you've got kind of true GitOps, where it's like, I've got my code over here, maybe I've written a Puppet module, and I know there's some code up in the forge, and I've got some, data as code, data in a Git repository. Just put those together for me and put it on a few servers for me. So that's kind of what in terms of, I said I was moving off the DevX team, but that's kind of the last thing I'm kind of writing, to be worked on, because I think it's a very important piece to kind of help people kind of get started and more immediately see that value. The other side is the tooling. I think obviously Puppet's coming up 20 years next year, and I think the expectations of tooling is much higher. I mean, I know we kind of talk about kids today or whatever are not kind of as hands-on or maybe aware of all the underlying components, but I think everything's moved on in how people expect to experience things. So I've had some quite interesting experiments with like Google IDX, which for people who don't know, kind of it allows you to basically go on to the IDX webpage. You can pull a repository in. It opens up VS Code. If you have a .idx file in your repository, it can then automatically install things like the Puppet VS Code plugin. It can install PDK, and then you can then just happily have a button on your repository and just click that, and it will take you away, and you immediately have developer tools and Gemini AI right there built in. So my other big thought is we need to make it easier just to kind of get all your Puppet developer tooling just immediately set up in one place, so people can just immediately pull it up. Whether that's in something like Google IDX, or whether it's in containers, or whatever the kind of appropriate modern developer environment is. That's my other big thing, because I don't want people to have to kind of piece together the exact right tools they should use in terms of development and testing.
Right. Yeah, I have my little kid, tiny Puppet, which should be wonderful in helping people doing things quickly.
Yes.
But, nobody cares about it in the Puppet world, so I'm still...
Well, I will say I care, because it's still. I mean, I know I've completely failed you, Alessandro, in terms of getting back, but it is still on my mind, because it's that abstraction just to help people, because you've got well, actually, I'll mention something else. Actually, thinking about it, but it's these suitable abstractions, because we've started talking about the Puppet data service again. And I think it's that thing of recognizing there's also going to be some people who want to interact with Puppet, but they don't want to have to learn, the full language, because yes, they have some motivation because they can see how well it works, particularly for the OS teams, and some teams are very close, but maybe they're just saying like, well, I'd like to be able to kind of pass some extra data in, or, I can see that great work you've done, but can you allow me to just adjust my classification slightly, and they don't want to have to kind of go through the whole kind of Puppet code deploy process, or equally they want to bring data from external sources, be that something like ServiceNow, or be it kind of their own in-house data, and Puppet data service has kind of been designed as a way to sit in between that, so that you can kind of have API access to whatever you choose to expose to that, and it kind of comes in as data can come in as trusted facts, or HIRA can kind of be read from that external source. So and I know there's a few projects around these kind of abstractions. So Tiny Puppet, HIRA Data Manager, from the beta dots, and I think kind of working out how to kind of present that well to new starts, I think that's kind of very important.
In terms of community, now we are recording this 2 or 3 weeks before this is going out. There has been some movement in the Puppet community. Can you tell us what is the situation and what is the commitment on the community by Perforce and Puppet?
Yeah, so recently there was a transfer of the community Slack account, which was owned by the previous community lead. It transferred actually to the Perforce IT accounts, which for me kind of helps. They can manage it. They have the service queues and the people to help me manage that community account. One of the things, as it moved, it caused all moderators to be removed, including myself. and also it caused the account to of the previous community leader to be deactivated. So, we heard everyone loud and clear. We immediately got, those accounts re-added as moderators and got that, user reactivated. Our strong message here is nothing is changing with that, with the Slack community. And in terms of open source, we're focused on getting new releases out. So, as we kind of talked about, Bolt version 4 is coming out. Should be within this month or at least this quarter. Debian 12, I know, was a kind of a big OS.
Finally.
Yeah. So that is that is in the nightlies and will come out in the Puppet October open source release for Puppet DB and Puppet Server. So I guess our kind of core message here is nothing has changed. It's just one of these things that I think there's a little bit of a lack of understanding, I'll put it that way. And one of the things we're kind of calling to do is we're going to have an ecosystem advisory board, and we're just going to come along with both Perforce and community and just talk about how are those Slack channels used. Because one of the things I think kind of went wrong there was, it was raised, the original Slack channel was kind of created after kind of breakup of the hip chat, which, you have to go way back to think about. It's certainly before my time. And things have evolved over time. So I think there was assumptions about how ownership should be and how things should be run. And, I'm very keen, now I've come into the community lead role to kind of get these things written down, so we can have that meeting, talk through exactly what everyone's needing out of it, and then get very clear so that, we don't have any of these kind of misunderstandings again. Or we will, but we just kind of work through each one as we get to them and get things written down. So everyone's very clear about, what Perforce's responsibilities are and, how, the community's responsibilities and how it should run. But we were going to talk a lot more detail at Config Management Camp as well in February about the community plan, and also look to get feedback, because it's a two-way system in terms of how Perforce acts as a good custodian for Puppet, and how the community can ultimately help us find the right approach for it as well.
Okay. In terms of let's say enterprise offering, there has been some products appearing, going away and changing and maybe integrated into Puppet Enterprise and so on. What is the current situation and what is the plan for the next years? Yeah,
so I think not so good timing in this. Maybe I think we will expect a kind of big update on roadmap shortly, but largely what you've kind of seen, as you highlighted, is the creation of kind of Puppet Enterprise Advanced, so that we're kind of able to kind of more easily bundle certain features like the compliance scanner, like CD for PE, and
so compliance scanner is the old Puppet Comply, so to say, the evolution of Puppet Comply. Okay.
So there's that kind of separation in terms of there's the compliance and enforcement modules, and then you've got the comply scanner, which is the CIS scanner. So I think what was recognized was a lot of our big enterprise companies have, when it's kind of comes piecemeal as they have to buy each thing, I think that's, and I can say from my own experience from working in working for a large bank, I think it's difficult to kind of put each one of those things you need through finance, through budget, through planning, and it starts becoming, as if you're buying a lot of different products, whereas in reality, it's more about kind of scaling up Puppet. So I think the aim, there is ultimately to have something like PE Advanced, where you are one of the larger customers and you need the more advanced features, and therefore those kind of things kind of come bundled in. So whether it's things like data connectors, because you have a lot of data and you have a big observability setup, whether it's the ServiceNow Spoke, which allows you to kind of create the self-service you might need in ServiceNow, particularly when you're working at scale, and things like CD for PE, which we know kind of our larger customers get the most advantage out of.
Okay, so all these are in the Puppet Enterprise Advanced offering. CD4P, the compliance modules, the compliance scanner, the ServiceNow integration, the data connector.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And we expect to kind of keep adding to this as we work out, exactly, what the customer needs are at that higher scale. To avoid it feel basically it's to avoid it feel like they're having to do lots of product adoptions. Because I think the reality was it was more kind of people coming to that advanced scale and advanced complexity, and they need extra tools, and they want them to kind of come from Puppet. And the way it kind of worked before was you'd end up having to say like, well, I've got this whole new tool CD for PE, and then that goes through a kind of a totally different pipeline in terms of how you finance that and how you get it delivered, particularly at large organizations. I used to always joke that even if you could turn Pocket Lint into gold, I couldn't get the product bought unless it was at the right time of the year. So it's that thing when it's an extension and something to be put into the contract, that's easy. When it's kind of lots of separate products, that's much harder to sell.
Right. I mean, a provocative question about CD4P. So we are now in version 5 without Kubernetes, which was a totally unnecessary thing, in my opinion, because not for the... do you have... I mean, the upgrade from CD4P 4 to 5. So basically, getting rid of the Kubernetes behind, using these containers at the end. But let's say, how is the migration happening in your customers? How is this supported? Because I don't think it's a straightforward move, an upgrade, so to say.
I mean, I think the key thing is in terms of the internals. It doesn't change your day-to-day view, and it doesn't change your pipelines. Obviously, V5 is has moved on a little bit in terms of some things, but typically what we see is a build ahead. So people kind of build out a new CDP infrastructure, and then migrate the data over there. And because the pipelines are important, it's one of those sort of events that you hold your breath a little bit, because you have to move your pipelines, and if you for a lot of customers, if the pipelines don't work, then the devs can't work. So it's very important for that, and typically support monitor those sort of events.
So just to be clear, the suggested upgrade path is new instance, configure it as it was done in the old one. Forget about the old data, which is not so interesting anymore, because at the end is past deployments. And that's it.
I mean, the configuration can be migrated over. It's just ultimately, it is a change in infrastructure, as you highlighted. I think the thing was, being overly honest, I think there was a period where we were looking to kind of think, well, Kubernetes is the way everybody's going, so all the products should run on Kubernetes.
I remember that period.
Yeah, and then we kind of found an interesting pattern with customers maybe, struggling somewhat with Kubernetes, or feeling like actually this was kind of an extra burden on them rather than an advantage. Now, some customers do want the ability to take those containers and run them in Kubernetes, but it was just trying to find the right balance. So I think, that V5 re-architecture, I think is a much better balance now. And, people have generally made the move very successfully. And yeah, I think it's one of these frustrating things, because, in a sense, the internals stay the same, and that's what people really care about. It's just that frustration when, in terms of the abstraction, the infrastructure, it just needs that adjustment to get it right from a product point of view.
Okay. So one of I do some specific questions, not too technical, but because I have direct involvement in this. One of the problems I see sometimes is the scale. Impact analysis, for example, is the typical culprit when there is a large infrastructure to cope with, and impact analysis sometimes becomes really slow. I know there have been some improvements in this area to maybe limit the amount of number of nodes where to run impact analysis or things like that. How is the situation? Because, I mean, honestly, impact analysis is the really selling point of CD4P. Otherwise, it's a normal CI tool which can produce in any CI solution, so to say. Impact analysis. So
sorry.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's, so there is a kind of focus down on impact analysis. I think we recognize how critical it is to customers. I think it's, in a way, it's almost a victim of its own success, in terms of once people kind of got a taste for like, yes, I want that impact analysis, they want to run it on everything. And obviously, as you say, as you do that...
David, they want to, some years ago, you could only run it on everything. There was not option.
Yes. Yes, no, absolutely. And I think working out, we worked out kind of how well it scales today, and and made that advice to customers, so that they had enough information coming through. I think there's also probably a little bit of an element here of, I think some of our customers would like better interpretation of some of the data coming out of impact analysis, because again, it can be a lot like a lot of Puppet things. You end up producing a lot of data, right? So I think, again, and I know AI becomes that horrible buzzword you just keep bringing up, but it's that thing. I think that's where some focus could go into impact analysis, to think about, well, how do we kind of make that data useful and more instantly interpreted? Because otherwise, it could too quickly become yet another source of things that people have to look through and understand.
Right. Okay. Is there a question that I haven't asked yet, but you would like to reply to?
I guess that there's we actually had quite a few conversations just about Puppet events. So obviously in this community lead role, one of the important things is events, and people have kind of talked about, we obviously used to have Puppet Conf back in the day, and I think a lot of organizations have had that struggle in terms of producing single vendor events, because it's much harder now, and people are so much more remote, in terms of doing events after. So I guess it's the question I get is what kind of events are Puppet planning to run, and I almost want to turn it back on a question of, I'm quite interested in hearing from people, what kind of events do they want to see Puppet at, and what kind of events do they think are they think we should be at, and what kind of locations as well, because I think trying to reach out to the Puppet community and where they are today is that interesting challenge for us, because config management camp is very good for us because we know we've got a good base in that sort of European region, but I'm quite interested in what other kind of events we can kind of focus community on. So I'm being cheeky there because I'm answering a question with a question, but that's
without answering.
without fully answering. I mean, I'm sort of interested in, like, hackathon, getting involved with those kind of organizations that run hackathons with universities, looking at similar events to config management camp, ideally in North America and APAC, to work out where are the infrastructure people now, because we know there's still a big base of users, and we also kind of want to kind of get out to those new users as well.
In terms of users, are they growing? Are they going down? If you have numbers.
So the state of open source report that comes out from OpenLogic, it's quite interesting, because overall the numbers were a little bit up in terms of usage. So and things like the UK, from my own local region, it kind of reported 30% of organizations are using Puppet in open source. I think the global figure was maybe 23-24%. So it's still a substantial number. I mean, to give reference, I think like Terraform is like, I think it was 28 or 30%. So it's clearly a kind of substantial number there. And I think that's the thing I'm just keen on, is to make sure that we're not, we've reached a maturity. We've got a lot of people with a lot of experience running these things. We're in big organizations, big complex organizations doing very important things, but it's making sure that people are still coming through and learning the skills and then coming in to work with the current community and also to kind of work with those companies to help all these things continue running. And as Chris said, just don't break anything.
Don't break anything, and let's try to find new ways and new people using it, attract new users, which is not easy, but you mentioned something about that, no? I would add also making things easier. Maybe we should start to tell to people that after all, one thing is the Puppet language, and one thing is using Puppet for doing things. And maybe I don't need to know Go in order to use a Go tool.
Yeah.
So, or configure a Go tool to do the things I need. So we still need to develop stuff with Puppet language, but maybe making things out of the box, ready to be used in good old simple YAML files, as it's totally possible in Puppet, could be a way to go through new people, no? A gentle introduction to Puppet world, so to say.
Yeah.
And I guess there is a lot to do in that sense, because it's really, it's true that is, as we were mentioned before, the learning curve is not so, is a bit steeper at some points. David, who should I invite to one of the next episodes? Some person that you would recommend to invite here in one of the next iterations?
I prepared because I having watched the first few episodes, I knew this question would come, so hopefully I'm better prepared. So I always recommend Nigel Kirsten.
He's going next. He's already recorded. So next week okay.
But also, I find Dylan Radcliffe, who used to work at Puppet, his work with Overmind's very interesting.
He's going next as well, already booked.
But don't worry, I did write a few people. I mean, I also think kind of some of the work that partners, obviously like yourself, do is very interesting. So like Dries Dams from Bricks, or Martin Efka from Betadots can be there can be very interesting conversations there, just kind of talking about how they're seeing the market in terms of how they partner with people. And I did have one more on my list because I knew this might be inevitable. The names I would think up would also be names you would think up. But I also think the kind of observability piece is quite interesting. So, Charity Majors, who, is at Honeycomb,
Okay.
they had quite an interesting book talking about, what true observability is as opposed to kind of, performance monitoring. So I think that could be quite an interesting topic because, coming back to all that kind of event information, it's kind of, really understanding what does it mean? Because, when you see a single event, well, what does that really mean in terms of those end users? How is it ran through your whole system and, how's the whole thing performing? You don't want to know just one thing's failed. You kind of want to know what context does that have and how is that affecting, the whole performance?
Yeah. Nice that some names keep on returning and they're always there. So, David, thank you very much. It has been useful for me. I'm a person interested in Puppet. I don't know for how many other people, but I guess, thank you very much for your talks.
No worries. Thanks for having us on.